Hi, my name's Phil. I'm talking about politics, and this is the Political Postbox, where each week I take a look at some of the comments that have appeared on the channel and add my own extra thoughts onto them, or if there are questions, sometimes sort of answer those questions as well. So going on to the first one, there's a couple of points on it really. So I'll just read it out first of all. So it says, it's so depressing being British at the moment. Yes, it is. Isn't it always though? This is all stuff I have been saying since before the referendum. It's painfully obvious someone like me I just don't understand why all the supposedly intelligent friends I have who voted for Brexit and continue to believe it will be good for the country still believe that even today. I'll pick on that point straight away. I mean, obviously you could ask them. I wish I could ask more Brexiteers what they really think, you know, in person, where I could actually have a conversation. I don't come across enough of them. Even though I live in the middle of Brexit land, they seem to avoid me somehow. But ultimately, when I have heard what people have said on this, usually it comes to, oh, well, you don't know what's going to happen. In which case, well, how do you know it's better? On no level does any argument actually work. And it's based on this belief, there's this sort of myth that got about, that, these economists, they all made these predictions and they were all wrong, they all got it wrong. Actually, they didn't, because when I've tried to sort of tackle people about these so-called predictions of the sky falling in the day after the Brexit referendum if we voted for leave, and I say to them, okay, so which top economists said this then? They're never able to name one. And if anyone tries it with you, bear this in mind. An economist would be, if they were making a prediction, and bear in mind, economists' predictions are reasonably accurate. This is how people make money. It's how investors make money. It's how banks make money. It's how countries don't go bust all the time as long as they follow sound economical advice. So of course you can predict it. Yes, there are a lot of factors there. It's really complicated. It sounds like, oh, how could anyone predict it? They can. And computer modelling, of course, plays a part in that. And yes, every now and then something goes wrong with the model, something changes that people don't account for, and it creates a larger than acceptable error. But by and large, they are able to predict it, which is how markets are able to function. You know, people investing, whether that's a country or whether it's individuals or groups of investors, they don't throw a dart at a stock board. You know, they use their intelligence, they use predictions. So, and what someone who is making an actual prediction will do is they'll consider lots of data and they will process it and they will come to a conclusion based on the analysis of those data, which means they'll have written a paper on it outlining their methodology. So if someone does try and name someone, you say, okay, then show me the paper where they produce these conclusions. It doesn't exist. You know, when they say, oh, such and such made this prediction, it tends to be a politician. That's what they tend to mean. A politician said this. May come as news to people, but politicians lie all the time. So in actual fact, we do know what the effects of Brexit will be. We don't always know to what extent it will be a disaster, but we do know certain aspects of it. Then the next one, it says, what is even more depressing is that many of my fellow Welsh people are sticking to their guns on Brexit too. Yes, it should be noted. I mean, even in Scotland, where they sort of say Scotland voted, significantly for Remain, which is true. There were still a lot of people in Scotland voted to leave as well, all through the British Isles. In Scotland, 2 out of every 5 people still voted for Brexit. It was pervasive. It's all over. But Wales, just like England, did vote to leave. So there were, of course, a large proportion of the population did vote to leave. It says it's going to be very bad for England, but absolutely disastrous for Wales. I mean, when you say England, I mean, again, you can't really consider England to be a single mass. The only reason we talk about the United Kingdom being Northern Ireland, Wales, England and Scotland is because all of those bits existed as kingdom. Well, Northern Ireland didn't, but there's Ireland. They all existed as separate kingdoms before, forming a union. Scotland joining the union was a lot more mutual, shall we say, than either Wales or Ireland. But they were all kingdoms in their own right beforehand. And at some point in the future, maybe the not too distant future, they will all be again. But that's the only reason why we lump them like that. But in reality, it makes no sense to call England England. in terms of a mass of people. For example, people in the north of England, where I come from, have much more in common, say, with the people of Scotland than we do the people of the south of England. You know, we're just as ignored by the bulk of people who live, let's face it, in the south of England. And therefore a lot of self-interest gets its own way there just because that's where most people are. The nature of democracy is it's the bulk of people and that's where they live. And also culturally more similar as well. Let us not forget that when Bonnie Prince Charlie and his crew were invading England, that they cleared through the north. They didn't have many problems there. It was only when they got to the south that they chickened out and ran away. So, you know, there's been a lot of mixing between the north of England and Scotland, much more so than, say, Scotland and the rest of England. But anyway, the point is that it is going to be disastrous for large tracts of England as well, including where I come from. And it says, I just wish my fellow countrymen and women were more like the Scots. At least they have a way out. Ah, yes, about that way out. This is where there's a huge, huge problem. Do you know what? I mean, for quite a while I've been sort of saying, and there's some credibility to this, you know, I don't think Nigel Farage really wants Brexit. He's had a nice little niche. He's a natural showman. He's very good on PR. He's a very good PR monkey. And he's found this brilliant niche where he gets paid pretty well for not having to do a lot. He just has to go and he has to give speeches and get given free pints of beer and stuff like that. It's brilliant. But it only works while we're in the EU and he's rabbiting on about leaving it. As soon as we leave the EU, what role does he have? And we can see what role he's going to have. Basically none. He's already pulled out of the general elections largely. So he's already losing his sense of identity in this country and his sense of wealth. So that's why he's eyeing America as somewhere he can go and raise some money. Maybe he thinks he can raise it quite easily. But the reason I say that is because I look at Nicola Sturgeon. I never seriously thought about this before, but now I'm wondering. Because Nigel Farage, any of his supporters would go, of course he wants Brexit. Of course he has. He's campaigned for this for so long. Yeah, it's funny how he kept making money while he was doing that, though, isn't it? From doing that. Does he really want it, or did he just see a niche where he had some marketable skills? And although I'm not fully seriously suggesting the same of Nicola Sturgeon, I am now beginning to wonder. So the SNP, never mind their Brexit position, their actual position, of course, the reason they were created, the reason they exist is to champion Scottish independence. They want to break up the Union. Scotland wants to go its own way. That's their core aim. Now, I've already said in the past that Nicola Sturgeon was foolish, but I keep banging on about the fact that she will not support Jeremy Corbyn unless he supports Scottish referendum. Now, Labour have said, the Labour leadership have said, and I would agree with this, by the way, that, not that they should say it, but I agree with the sentiment, that ultimately, if the Scottish Parliament determined that there might be realistically a majority in Scotland in favour of independence, Westminster should not block a referendum. And Labour have basically said that. They said they would oppose independence, but they would not seek to block a referendum if it were emerging from the Scottish Parliament. That's fair enough, but unwise to be bringing this to the public mind. And I say this because in 2017, the referendum, the big stick that was used to beat Jeremy Corbyn with was, if you vote Labour, you will end up with an SNP Labour coalition and the dissolution of the Union. Now, we all know that actually it's the Conservatives that are the real threats to the Union. However, the Scottish Parliament cannot force a referendum on independence. It does require Westminster to do that, and the Conservatives as a majority wouldn't do that. If Nicola Sturgeon really wanted independence, it would be in her interests not to keep reminding people that voting for Jeremy Corbyn risks the Union. And by saying, you know, the price for our cooperation will be this, that's sort of bringing it back into people's minds. And then this week, was this weekend, Sunday just gone, I think it was. Nicola Sturgeon said, there's another little price. She's adding a bit now, a red line. So now, not only will she not support Labour, so she says, without that, she's now also said that she won't support Labour unless they commit to scrapping Trident. Now again, I don't want us to have nuclear weapons. And given that, the old argument usually with nuclear weapons is it gives you a bit more clout in the world. And I'm not going to completely discount it. All I'm going to say is we've lost so much clout in the world already. I don't really think a few Trident missiles are going to swing it back in our favour. And I don't like the fact that we have them. And there are other countries, powerful countries, who do not have them and don't feel the need to have them. So I wouldn't oppose that. And it's also bloody expensive when we have to keep buying new nuclear weapons. So, okay. But at the same time, again, what you're doing by saying that is shining a spotlight on the fact that, again, another stick they used to beat Jeremy Corbyn with, he gets beaten by a lot of sticks. Some of them fairly, some not so much. Is, of course, he's a pacifist. He doesn't really like military engagement. That doesn't mean to say that, he'd dismantle the military. We know that's not true. He's actually made certain commitments to the military. But he has said quite clearly he would never use nuclear weapons. I hope he personally wouldn't use military weapons of any kind, but he wouldn't authorise the use of nuclear weapons. And so we know he would love to get rid of them as well. We know that he's campaigned with the CND, but a lot of people look at that as, oh, you want to weaken our defences, because some people still view nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And it's just another thing that's going to give the Conservatives an easy win. This notion of, because polls are a bit divided on how well the Liberal Democrats are going to do. There isn't really a firm belief that the numbers will be there for a Liberal Democrat Labour coalition, even if both sides are willing. But bear in mind, the Liberal Democrats said that they won't support Jeremy Corbyn. Even as a minority government, they won't support him. Whereas the SNP will. So that, and SNP are very likely to sweep Scotland. Not get all the seats, but bloody well nearly all of them. That is realistic, in fact, pretty likely. The capacity for Parliament to return numbers such that Labour plus the SNP could form a majority is more realistic than it was in 2017. I'm not saying it's likely, but it is more realistic. And again, those fears are going to be levelled at Corbyn. And Nicola Sturgeon is just playing to it. And the thing is, if what she's doing is going to damage Labour's position, and it makes a Conservative majority more likely, if there's a Conservative majority, she's not going to get a referendum. She's not. And I would accept, by the way, that a much larger number of SNP MPs would be a bloody good indication that Scotland was ready for independence. Well, ready to vote for it, shall we say. And by acting in this way, she's making that less likely. So I think to myself, and I am only semi-seriously thinking it, but I am now more semi-seriously thinking it, does she not want Scottish independence? Is she again like Nigel Farage? I know all the supporters in there going to go, no. But just consider this. So do the supporters of Nigel Farage. Does she maybe just find it politically expedient to pretend to be a Scottish nationalist? Or not? I'm not as convinced as I am of Nigel Farage because it's only just occurred to me. But yeah, it does occur to me. Maybe she does. Anyway, God, we've spent a long time on that one. Let's go on to the next one. So, next one should be a bit quicker. Says, I've also got BBC Breakfast News on and they've just interviewed a lady using a food bank. So we're talking about someone so poor they can't really afford food. Who likes the Green Party. Okay. But also is thinking of voting Tory because of Boris Johnson. And again, it comes down to the reason why people who are not politically aware, which is the vast majority of voters, vote for anyone. They vote based on the promises made. Boris Johnson is promising the earth. He's promising more jobs. He's promising more money for the NHS, more police, more everything. But at the same time, lower taxes. That's what he's promising. He's promising you will pay lower taxes, but I will spend more on the things. No one joins those things up. I mean, a poor person of all people should understand that if you reduce your income, and taxation is income for the government, if you reduce your income, you can't afford to spend more. But the reason, I was talking about this on Patreon live stream today, or yesterday rather, the reason why people do this is because if, let's say you get someone who says they're thinking of voting Conservative or even are going to vote Conservative, and let's say you don't think they're the sort of person who would benefit from that. And let's say that person also voted Conservative in 2017. And you think to yourself, so, right, but they didn't follow through on the promises from 2017. Why would you believe their promises now? You ask that person what the Conservatives promised in the 2017 general election manifesto. I'll bet you they could name, if they can name anything, one thing, and that is Brexit, where no deal is better than a bad deal. That was the only line, and that's only because they kept banging on about it for so long, for like 2 years after that general election. So it stayed in the public consciousness. I'll bet you they couldn't name a single other promise from that election campaign. There might be a few who can. I bet most can't. And that's the issue, you see. So they fall for these promises. Then the promises don't materialise, but they forgot what they were. They forgot what those promises were. They know life's still crap for them. But they'll, well, one, believe the lies that it's someone else's fault. But two, they'll have forgotten that this government promised a thing. And so so the next election will come around, they'll make the same old promises, the same old lies, and they don't learn. They don't think to themselves, hang on a minute, you promised that last time and didn't deliver it. Why would I believe you this time? They don't think of that because they don't remember. That's ultimately what the issue is there. And the next one, that was a quick one. So it says, did the Tories introduce austerity which greatly reduced our GDP growth and make huge tax cuts for the rich? Guilty as charged. Indeed, and this is ultimately the problem, and we're headed for more of it. Austerity, when you look at the facts, when you look at what it's delivered in this country, all it did was allow the wealthiest in the country to massively increase their wealth. They basically, on average, doubled it. The poorest got poorer. In fact, the number of people in poverty massively increased as well. National debt has skyrocketed. The economy has been piss poor all the way through. Austerity was never, ever about fixing the economy. It was never going to do that. It defies all economic wisdom. You know, there have been Nobel Prize winning economists saying how ridiculous this is. You don't do this. What the austerity? And the other thing is, like, even globally, governments that have introduced austerity have never fixed their economy with it. It never works. The way you get out of a bad situation is you borrow and you invest so that you can get a return later. And then, when you go through your period of growth, you fix your economy. Then what you do with the extra is that's when you put it away again. And we can understand this on an individual basis. You know, people who have got a sensible attitude to finance, which is not everyone, certainly not me. You know, when you're in work and you're making more than you really need, you spend a bit extra on yourself, of course you do. But you put money away, you put it aside in savings. And then let's say you have a bad patch where you lose your job or you just have to take a different job that's paying less. Maybe you need to dip into those savings a little bit. And then things look better at some point in the future and you start saving again. We understand that on an individual basis. We understand that, like, you can't, for example, on an individual basis, let's say you end up with a much lower paid job. You can't just say, right, I need to save money, I'll stop eating food. Or the way I liken it with the attitude to all this sort of thing is you can't just say, right, I'm going to save on petrol by quitting my job. I can't afford petrol, so I'll quit my job. Well, then you lose the whole income. What you need to do is, if there's things you can do without, fair enough. But at the end of the day, that doesn't apply to government expenditure. Well, actually, there is one form of government expenditure we can do without, and that's giving it to private companies. But we can't do without healthcare. We can't do without a fire service. We can't do without a police service. The Conservative government have begged to differ by closing down fire stations, by closing down police stations, by massively underfunding the NHS, and by increasing the amount of the proportion that's left, giving it to private companies. But yeah, it defies all economic wisdom on the individual and the national and global scale. It has only enriched the rich, the already rich, and impoverished the already poor, and the ones who weren't poor but are now. So, indeed, yes. Next one says, Trump is a Russian asset, just like Johnson, both playing for the same team. Johnson, a carbon copy of Trump. Johnson is behaving himself, but would be a full-on Trump if he got a large majority. This is actually my very genuine fear. When you look at the way Boris Johnson has behaved, when he wasn't getting his own way with Parliament, the way he behaved, he made it quite clear, although we don't really see him as necessarily being as extreme as Trump, he is, and I think you're right, if he gets a majority, he will be untamable. He has shown that there are no depths to which he will not sink in order to get his way. He's demonstrated that without doubt. If he gets a majority, he will enact the most awful policies. And I don't know what I'd be more worried about. The fact that people will have voted for him and then realise just how much they've screwed themselves over in a couple of years or a few months. Or the fact that they won't. and maybe the other parties will sort themselves out and realise that they actually failed because they could have stopped Boris Johnson. The opposition parties could have stopped him stone dead, and they didn't. They had a numerical advantage in Parliament and they did not pursue it. And it doesn't matter who you blame for that. The opposition parties collectively didn't stop him, and they could have done, and maybe they'll sort themselves out and do a bit of soul searching, and a better opposition will emerge that may still not win at the next one, because he'll have successfully hoodwinked everyone else. The only way to stop Boris Johnson, unfortunately, if he wins a majority, is to ensure that all of the tricks he employs are illegal, which will be impossible because he'll have a majority in Parliament. He will decide what laws are enacted. More importantly, he'll decide what laws are repealed. And he's already threatened to repeal laws on anti-racism, environmental laws, and of course massively deregulates the financial services in this country. It's yes, I mean the concept of full-on Trump, if he gets a decent sized majority, is a very real prospect, not only because he is prepared to do that, but because the sort of candidates that the Conservative Party are currently promoting actively lend themselves to that. They are much more on the extreme right wing. So the Parliamentary Conservative Party, on balance, will have shifted much more to the right after the next Parliament. Well, in the next Parliament, I should say, after the next general election. And this is a serious worry that, you know, on any general election, I, as a socialist, always fear a Conservative government. And it's always terrible when it happens. This time, I think it could snap something in the country, really genuinely break the country. Someone was saying on Patreon, Boris Johnson is promising to forge a new Britain. I believe that. I believe that promise. Because think about what that means. He's setting fire to the country, and at the end of it, it won't be recognisable from what it is now. That's what forging a new Britain would mean. That the Britain that exists now will not exist. It will be something else. So that promise, I believe. Anyway. Next one. Someone saying, disgraceful, but nothing will happen. The Tories believe they are untouchable. The lack of action against them would suggest they are right. So this is referring to the dodgy sites they've been putting on, pretending, just like Leave.eu did during the Brexit referendum, putting on sites that made it look like they were independent, like research sites, fact-checking sites, and they weren't, of course. The Conservatives have been doing that this election campaign. No surprise at all. They've employed people specifically to do that. The couple of guys they employed who do this sort of thing, present misinformation campaigns on social media. So it is no surprise at all. And they will keep doing it. And as you say here, they believe they're untouchable. The lack of action against them suggests they're right. They are right. Because when it comes to social media, there are very few laws that are really fit for purpose. And the other problem is there are still laws that apply there. That is why in the referendum, certain campaigns were found to have broken the law. And there are still criminal investigations sort of underway, being blocked and delayed. But there's no one with real oversight over them. So you only really find these things out. They only come to the fore in the first place. Think about what caused the illegality of Leave.eu and the Vote Leave campaign to come to the public eye and to have investigations started. It wasn't our law enforcement authorities doing this. It was investigative journalists. They carried out the groundwork and then passed it on to the authorities, who then took it over because evidence was presented. They didn't find that evidence themselves because they weren't looking, and the reason for that is there is no one with oversight over election campaigning on social media. There are various groups who have oversight over various aspects of election campaigning. None of those groups have responsibility for online campaigning, is ultimately where the problem is. So there's no one looking out for it other than journalists. And it takes them some time because they need information from whistleblowers, say, and this all takes time to come through. Long after the event. And then what happens? Nothing, because then the people who broke the law are the ones in charge of the police, who can then threaten those law enforcement agencies, the National Crime Agency, the Metropolitan Police, with funding cuts if they don't, It's like, oh, do you really think that investigation's worth it? It's a waste of money. If you're in the habit of wasting money, I'm going to have to cut your funding. That sort of thing was directly used against the National Crime Agency, for example. And it won't stop. It will never stop until we get a government that takes this seriously. And I don't even know that the next non-Conservative government would take it seriously. I hope it would, but I don't know that. That's the problem. Because we'd be asking a government ultimately to legislate against dirty tricks. And once a government achieves power, it doesn't necessarily always want to change the system that got it that power. But for the future, it absolutely has to. And final one. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with this one, though. I like the sentiment. Johnson's failure to answer a straight question hasn't gone unnoticed. Unfortunately, I think it has. I mean, the people who notice are the people who are Boris Johnson's political opponents anyway, the ones who notice in general. We've been noticing him for years. And of course, the fact that he hasn't answered a straight question hasn't gone unnoticed to us. But you know what? We weren't going to vote for his party anyway. I was going to say vote for him. Very few of us actually have the opportunity to vote for him or vote against him. But for his party, we weren't going to do that anyway. The people who are going to vote for him are the ones who are not taking notice of the fact that he's not answering a straight question, because no one's drawing attention to the fact in a format that'll get to everyone. There may be a small number of people who are having it drawn to their attention, but the population at large, no. The media are not pointing out that he's just refusing. If some media do, like The Independent or The Guardian or The Mirror, for example, they'll just say, well, they don't like Boris Johnson anyway. Which is true, they don't. But the reason they don't like him is because he's a tosser. Ultimately that. So I'm afraid I am going to have to disagree with that. I wish it were true, because if it were true, Boris Johnson would not be winning a majority at this general election. He may not still. He couldn't even form the largest party. He may do that. He may get his majority. It's all up in the air. He's certainly the most likely. He's the only party that could possibly get that. And it is a realistic possibility. It's all very tight. When you look at polls on a constituency basis now, it's no point in looking at polls for the national feeling. It has to be based on how would you vote in your constituency. And there are polls predicting reasonably a Conservative majority, but the numbers are so tight. It involves them winning a whole host of seats very narrowly. So, you get, I'll be talking about more of this Saturday actually, but you get more people out to vote, and it could swing those seats the other way. Bearing in mind in 2017, although Labour got way fewer seats than the Conservatives, way fewer, nonetheless, it would have only taken a few votes here or there in quite a number of seats, could have swung it the other way. Easily could have swung it the other way. The parliamentary numbers in the last general election were determined by quite a lot of Conservatives winning narrowly, which meant in a lot of those seats, Labour or the Lib Dems losing narrowly. Now you switch that the other way and you can have a different thing. It's just that at the moment, the polling evidence is that it's going to go the Conservatives' way. But like I said, all those people who at the moment are not necessarily going to be voting, get them registered. Tell them to register. Even if they don't want to vote, just tell them to register before it's too late, because then if they change their mind, then they can vote. If they don't register and they change their mind, they're stuck. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting this week. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.